It all began, as so many bad things do, with a good intention. The power of magic, the might of Chrylsis himself, was brought to bear in the creation of something that would, in the end, spell the downfall of many of his own kind, and the beginning of the end for the lesser entities of the spheres. The intention had been a noble one, to help another in need, to bridge the gap between the daemon source and the deified host, but this was not to be. Fate, it seems, has a way of bending the reality of a circumstance against intended wishes, and creating more problems than could ever have been foreseen. Daemons were born of the source, the demonic essence that resides deep within the demonic planes. Upon each demonic plane lies a controlling daemon, unique in its own right. They feed upon the magic that resides in all, stripping it from the worlds and planes, bolstering their strength. Creatures born entirely of magic become one with them, and their knowledge is passed on. War was a way of existence among the demonic planes, as they vied for portions of power that others had, in order to strengthen their own and survive against the odds. Each daemon is born of a sliver of the demonic essence that is the source, but it cannot enter the prime directly. These places, where chrylsis and others had created nexuses that bore life and nodes to the other planes of existence, it instead created its own lesser versions, children of their visage, to push forth and find more power, and the gods themselves had made this possible. Until the worlds had arrived, floating in the void, anchored by nodes and nexuses and flows of magic, the daemons had no way to gain more power, other than by warring upon their own kind, as they had no contact, no way of pushing forth. However, once they had such, they spilled forth in an endless assault upon that which now touched their homelands. In the distant past, Chrylsis had taken it upon himself to craft upon many worlds, and in doing so began crafting life along with the other entities and forces of the cosmos. Many worlds were fused into being, and in time many had form and then life upon them. Upon one of them, the forces of the daemon planes pierced the void, and gained a foothold, feasting upon the energy of the world that had been created. As the daemons themselves could not pierce the veil, their lesser forms, to be known eventually to the denizens of those planes as demons, wrought havoc in their stead, soon becoming the scourge of the creations of life. Those of the deified host sent agents of their own to aid in repelling these hordes, but they were not used to this threat, and were ill prepared for the assaults. In defending this world a grave error was made, as the daemons discovered a new source of sustenance, more potent than the winds of magic, and so they swept across the lands, through the plains, and resided inside the lesser creatures of existence, for they had tasted the divine. Eventually the demonic forces began to rend holes in the reality of the world with their newfound power, bleeding their planes onto the prime and eventually creating a rip in the very fabric of reality. Chrylsis saw this, and knew he could not interfere with such matters directly. His initial encounters with the demonic source aeons past had indicated that should the void ever be removed, the deified host would be devoured in time, with little to no way of directly combating their demise. Although the source itself showed no direct interest in absorbing them, those spawned of his essence, the daemons, and all of their ilk, would readily strip the energy from the gods themselves. He sought a pact with the demonic host, and appeared to them. They, of course, attacked, and tried to rip his power from him, but they underestimated the one true power, and were pushed back with ease, as they had not the power to harm him, not with their own energies this far removed from the source. The rip they had torn was mended, as their kind were pushed back, and this first incursion was abated. It was then that Chrylsis hit upon the idea, the notion, to help them, and this is where the seed of an idea would become a blight to existence, and eventually flourish into one who would be the destroyer of all. Daemons were born of instinct, of hunger, and needed to feed. His plan was a simple one, to give them what they sought so they would no longer burn with their hunger, no longer need to feed, to kill, to annihilate. He would make them as he, one of his host. The source agreed after much time, and a sliver of the source was gifted to chrylsis upon a prime place created for this occasion, so that the plan could be born into reality. This sliver that was gifted was taken from one who would later become known to the realms as Terraspine. This daemon essence was nurtured with the energies of chrylsis, gifting it immense power, but such an infusion could not be held within the daemon's essence, as in order for it to exist past the prime, it would need a form that it could carry onward towards the place where the host itself resided. And so chrylsis crafted a vessel, a form, a body. The essence learned quickly of its nature, its truth, and understood that it was of the source. It traversed the demonic planes briefly in order to see what had borne it, but the source could only be viewed afar as a speck of raw power, unreachable even by those who were true daemons. This half-breed could no longer nest deep enough within the magical planes to see its creator, and realize that, despite its power, it could never know that which the rest of its kind knew, the hunger for existence. The seeds of anger began to grow. Why had this being borne him and given him to another? Why had the other made chains that would hold him for an eternity at bay from his own progenitor? Why had they both consorted to bring him into existence, only to torment him with such vistas? Chrylsis watched on as the creation, born of hope, turned slowly to inward thoughts and began to question Chrylsis's actions as well as his own very existence. It was then that Chrylsis made the mistake, the crucial error that would seal the fate of so many in short order, but untold billions in future times yet to pass. Chrylsis opened a gateway, a passage to the host, so that his creation could meet the others within the host, and see what marvels awaited him with his new form. His creation looked on at his creator, and watched intently how the magic moved around him, and how the gates had been called forth. He would soon see what no daemon had ever seen, what none not of the host, not even the source itself, could ever know. It was his gift from chrylsis, the knowledge of existence, and he wanted it. In the time he had spent upon the plains, he learned quickly that he could not be harmed by others of his kind, daemons that is, as the body chrylsis had crafted him was born of the host itself. No daemonic magic could enter the place where the host resided, as there was no way of carrying it through the barriers that protected them, and there was also no way of penetrating that which was known as the void. Although the void could be seen across, such as the inky blackness between the two sides of a chasm, anything that entered the void simply ceased to be, and the newborn had no wish to discover this firsthand. However, he had been given entry by the Lord of the Host, their creator, their leader, their very own source? He waited, and then entered the place of the gods. He took in these vistas, a place where all the planes were visible, stretching out in an endless sea of colour and form. Nestled within these ebbs and flows were objects, awash with many magics, wherever they were touched by the planes that surrounded them, like corks bobbing on the ocean. These were the locations of the primes, places crafted by the host. These were the places where life was, where the embers of life burned. And with a long stare and the awe-inspiring sight washing over him, he found what he was looking for, one small spot of prime. A specific spot of prime that had meaning to his existence, for it was the place he had come into being when the source had given his essence to chrylsis to fashion his identity. He asked if that was the place where he had been born into this shell, and chrylsis assured him that the place he had seen was indeed the place of his origins. The host looked upon the creation chrylsis had brought before them, and they were in awe. But some were confused. After all, there was a host they knew nothing about. Chrylsis called them all together so he could introduce them to their new member. And this is where the mistake became apparent. Chrylsis announced that all were present, and the newcomer looked over their number. So many creations like him, but not like him. Each born of this chrylsis, and yet none as unique as him, for they were all born of the power of the host, and nothing else. They were pure, but he, however, was not. He hungered for knowledge, for experience, for, well, more than he was. He had a hunger that could not be sated, and it gnawed at his essence, urging him to feed. But he felt no hunger. The thoughts of his demonic lineage were pushing him, urging him to feed, despite his lack of need, and they could not see it. And as they began to speak to him, the voices of the host became mingled with the voices from his essence, and his identity became known. He let out a cry of rage, of pain, of anguish, stunning them all into silence as he clawed at his body, trying to let himself out, but found that he could not even harm himself. Chrylsis stepped forth and placed a hand upon his shoulder, trying to calm him, saying simply, "You cannot harm yourself, as host may not harm host. It is one of the laws of the host." He continued, "The magics of the host are not able to harm others of the host here." Laws, he thought, but he had a question. If magics of the host could not harm the host, what about something not of the host? He said, raising his head slowly towards Chrylsis. Chrylsis looked toward him, and then slowly turned his attention to the mass of hosts that were waiting for his reply. "Leave! Now!" he shouted, as his creation lifted his hand and touched the nearest of the host, and channeled his demonic powers into his target. The target host dropped to the floor, twitching, but the power continued to flow forth, enveloping him and feeding upon the fallen. "Yes!" he screamed. "I shall hunger no more! I can feel!" And he turned to Chrylsis, only to find he had already moved far from his touch. "No, this was not how it was meant to be," he said, his voice shaking, trembling as he sought to find a solution quickly before more of the host were taken. "Oh, do not worry, Father. I will not come for you yet." And he turned his attention to the hosts who were now starting to move away. "Not when I have so much more to learn first." Demonic tendrils shot out, wrapping around the nearest of the host, lifting some from the floor, running some through, but incapacitating all, allowing him to feed. However, he had underestimated the sheer volume of power within the hosts, and once he had committed himself to the hunt, and then to the feeding, he could no longer control himself as his hunger took over, forcing him to stop in his tracks as the demonic essence within him took hold and its primal instinct to feed came forth. Chrylsis took this moment, this failure of his own judgment and lack of foresight, to open another gateway. He looked toward the fallen and drained husk of the former host that had been struck first, and, shedding a tear, focused his power upon his creation. There was a flash of light, and then nothing. The scene was empty, and the injured host and creation were gone. He knew he could not save them from that grasp, and once he had engaged, he saw he could not prevent him doing so, for once feeding, he could not stop until done. It took that moment of inaction to drop him back to a small pocket of prime, the first that came into his thoughts, the place where he had made his folly. The hosts all gathered quickly, asking for guidance, demanding an answer for their fallen brethren. But Chrylsis had none. All he could do was tell them what he had done and what he had hoped for, and they understood. They did not all take it well, but they did understand. The gateway had been closed the instant he had been removed from the gathering of the hosts, but one asked the simple question: where is he now? chrylsis looked to them and paused before answering. He is... oh no, he is on the Awakening Prime. The place he had chosen to create this host had been on the one place that he and the Source had used as neutral ground over the eons. It was also the place where fallen hosts and potential could travel to from the other primes in order to ascend to be one with the host. It was in fact a direct line to the other primes. chrylsis summoned his power forth and turned to channel it towards the place, only to be interrupted by a booming noise as his creation arrived, passing through a gateway of his own making. "I thought it would be harder to get back up here," he said, as he started moving towards the nearest host. "No more!" chrylsis cried out, directing his power towards the attacker, stopping him in his tracks, but he could not banish him back to the Prime, as he was protected by the body, the shell he had created, and as he had stated, host could not harm host here. "Father, I will feast and you cannot stop me, and when all are gone, you will be the last, and then I will take the Source." He smiled evilly and tried to move, but he could not, and the voices began to rise once more, demanding he feed, he consume, he rend their shells. He turned his attention to chrylsis and lashed out, trying to lessen the power directed at him, but his power could not breach the full might of chrylsis. It was a stalemate. One host stepped forward and turned to chrylsis. They spoke inside his mind. "You cannot banish him while he resides within the shell. I will bring him out, then act and send him back to whence he came, and not the Prime." And with that, the host walked up to them and placed their hands upon them. "No!" chrylsis cried out. "Yes!" screamed his creation, as the voices pushed him to unleash his powers, but not at his creator, but at the host that touched his form. An easy target, he thought, and then realized his error. The now vulnerable daemon and soon-to-be-lost light were gone in the blink of an eye, and chrylsis immediately began drawing power from the host, turning it towards the Prime where he had sent them. Across the vista stretching out towards the Awakening Prime, his magic blasted, a channeled beam of pure power striking it in the distance, ripping it from the anchors it had, rending the nodes asunder and tearing it from the connections that had kept it tied to the Primes, as well as other planes. Then the host set about recovering from the ordeal, regaining their strength and mourning their losses. chrylsis spent a long time ensuring that his creation was trapped and could not venture back to the Prime worlds, carefully removing connections, blocking nodes, and disconnecting planar anchors, and ensuring it was unable to claw its way back from where he had exiled it. Upon the Prime where he sat, it was quiet. He had fed, and he was satiated on more knowledge and power than he had fathomed could possibly exist. Each host he had taken was itself a vast store of knowledge, of experiences, and of course, raw power of the very gods themselves. He could survive upon this feasting for millennia easily, without the need to feed, but he would need to make plans to gain more power if he was to enact his will upon chrylsis and the Source. He tried in vain to open a gateway to the host, but found that all ties had been severed. He reached to the planes and found those too no longer to be attached. Still, he had struck a blow that even the Source could not achieve. He had brought low one of the lights, and then 5 more, and to finish with one last who gifted themselves to him. This had indeed been a day of note for his existence, and the husks of the fallen would lay here in memory of his deeds, his trophies. He would drift here forever, or at least for a very long time, planning, exploring this limited space, and practicing his newfound skills. The prime place that was now his home was beset with strange constructs and buildings that his host knowledge told him were in fact temples to the hosts, as well as shrines that could act as direct communication lines with their specific host. These will be useful in future times. He just didn't understand how to use them, yet. But he did understand he was what was known as a fallen host, a god cast down from on high. However, unlike those usually cast down, he was far from stripped of his power. In fact, he had more, much more than he had to begin with. He waited, dormant for millennia, until his pocket plane drew close to a small demonic plane, and then the creeping blight of conflict began anew. The daemons channeled and extended their plane towards his, and eventually they were close enough to allow a connection to be established. It was at this point he awoke from his slumber, alerted by the presence of new magic. He waited at first and allowed them to establish a solid portal, and then, as their magic began to wash over his home, he siphoned it off, tasting it, and learning about this invader. He did not know this daemon, and so he waited and gleaned what he could about their kind, but he knew that should he make his presence known, they would simply cut the cord and set him loose once more, and he could not have this. However, he was also a daemon, or at least he had been. He reasoned that with the knowledge the hostess gifted him with, and the knowledge he was born with from his origins, that he could make a lesser version of himself. But as hard as he tried, he discovered that he could not. He tried to craft a shell from magic to host a portion of himself that he could control and send forth to view this other plane, but he was unable. Apparently, he had not been gifted with this ability. In truth, he had never been gifted a demonic home plane, and therefore could not sire spawn the way other daemons could. He would realize this in time, as more magic was drawn from this incursion and the knowledge that came with it, until eventually a larger presence was felt, a holder of knowledge, a true form of a lesser of his kin. This demon had been sent to scout out, now an anchor had been made, to seek out what resided here, and discover what power could be taken, and what forces would be needed. It sensed the host immediately, and sought it out. It stood in all its misshapen glory before the host's shell, and touched it tentatively, and being shocked by the sheer power it held, it was stunned for a while, and he took advantage of this chance. He let his demonic power reach out and envelop this invader. He studied it intensely, saw what it was, how it was created, and most importantly, which plane it was a part of. He would always know this type of daemon now. The voices started up at the opportunity of food within its grasp, and he willed them to stop. They did not, and as they built to a crescendo, he tried to shut them out, diverting his thoughts to creating a smaller of himself, a lesser, just as this was a lesser of its master. And that's when it happened. The demonic energies enveloping the demon began to strip the magic from it, unraveling the threads that crafted it and making them part of his own makeup. As this was being done, his thoughts of creating a lesser came to fruition, but not as he had hoped for instead of what he was aiming to craft, he instead made a duplication of that which he was consuming. The original demon was devoured, totally, but this newly crafted one was the same in every way bar one. It was his. It felt like the original. The magic was the same. The abilities it held infused within its threads were the same. It was indistinguishable from the original in all ways, but he could sense it was his. He had created his first lesser, his first minion, and although it was not of his design, he revelled in the fact he could at least control it. He sent this creation out into the plane that had attached itself to his own, and looked around, taking it all in, and discovering that the denizens of this plane could not detect that it was not of their own magic. It walked among them, seen but not sensed as an intruder, merely one of their own. Even the Daemon Overlord itself seemed not to notice. He tried to create another, but found that he could not. He kept on trying, but eventually tried to create something else he had encountered, one of the hosts he had slain. This worked, and it felt, sensed, and to all intents and purposes was the same as the original. The only thing was that it had no knowledge that he did not gift it, and it had no instinct or thought that it did not have before it fell. He experimented while his lesser form walked the plains, gathering information and absorbing magic from each new place it went, and discovered that whatever he created, even though these duplications were of the hosts themselves, he could only produce one of each of them, and they could do nothing that he had not witnessed or been exposed to himself, or by their absorbed experience. They were merely shadows of their former selves, even though they had their raw power, should he decide to gift it back to them. This testing of his powers of creation garnered attention from the attached plane, and more demons were sent to investigate, and each time they came, they were taken, absorbed, duplicated, and sent back. This continued for many years, which is a blink of an eye for demonkind. Eventually, he had control of almost all of the demonic forces of the plane next to his, and he chose to leave his host creations on his current home to act as guardians and bait for more demonic scouts, and pass through the portal to the demonic realm that was now mostly of his own puppets. He sensed the demonic overlord immediately and drew a breath of the magics of this realm, gaining a sense of direction, intent, and power of this creature. It sensed him, and the realm itself twisted and erupted forth a large and powerful manifestation of raw physical power. He stood there and studied it, the size, the power, taking it all in. The threads of magic told him exactly what abilities it had, as well as their lethality towards himself. He smiled as it charged him, and he let it hit him head on. It slammed into him and he gave no ground. The Overlord ripped at his form, twisting itself around him, wrapping the very plane itself around, enveloping him with its raw power, and still he allowed it. He wanted to see how they fought, how they reacted, and how they drew their power from their realm, which itself was directly a part of their own immense power. After an hour or more of study, he grabbed it by the massive misshapen head and held it fast, looking directly into its eyes and smiling as he let a portion of his demonic power out to touch this prey. The daemon reeled in panic. It had never known fear, but now it knew, and squirmed and thrashed, trying to escape, but it could not. However, instead of fighting back, it began to shed its power from its main form, creating myriad of lesser forms, and they scattered around the realm as fast as they could travel. But he just fed, savouring the taste of his own kind, and bolstering his own abilities. It was strange, as this demon had its own abilities, and yet he could not fathom his own. All he had seemed to have was the ability to create what he saw, what he was exposed to, and then absorbed. Soon these demonic energies became his, and he too was able to perform the tricks and powers that it had had. But it was a hollow victory. It had stood no chance at all. But this meant that the others would also fall in his wake with ease. He enveloped the remaining running essence as they tried to escape, the remnants of the power of the Overlord. He then drew in the magical energy of the realm itself, as this contained the remaining essence of the Overlord, thereby wiping it from existence. He left enough to stand upon next to the portal back to his home, and started to exude his own raw demonic energies into this plane, bolstering what was left, and moulding it to his own design, his own essence. It was, after all, merely threads of magic, and all the things within a demonic plane, be it daemon, land, air, or creation, all bore the same markings. He turned his attention to the realm he stood within and concentrated, and found he could shape the land, move the magic, pull it into himself at will. He moulded the realm to the size of a small town, and populated it with a myriad of misshapen demons that he had drawn into himself in his conquest. He had absorbed his first demonic plane, and he felt somewhat content with his first victory, even if it was hollow. It was the start of many more to come, and the beginning of attention from the rest of the daemons. Before long, the war he waged upon the plains slowed, as many daemons pulled their planes away from his, and ensured he could no longer tear their threads of existence into his own make-up. During this onslaught, however, he managed to devour dozens of the daemon overlords, taking their home planes and increasing his powers many times over, before they realized they were drawing back. He let them go, and turned his attention to the primes. Slowly, he practiced reaching out across the planes he had in his command, but found that over time, as they were essentially the same magic, they drew toward each other, gravitating to their own kind, and began to coalesce into a single, gigantic plane. Using his knowledge of existence, the gift he was given by chrylsis when he was with the host, he positioned this subverted plane around a prime, and let them draw together so they pushed upon that prime, and in time, forced a connection through which he could send his power. It was the start of his own incursions onto the primes, and his first arrival was met with almost no resistance, but instead led quickly to the demise of the poor creatures that dwelled there, as he drew them into himself and created duplications of them to inhabit this prime. He would use this in future times as bait for other daemons, and he discovered that he could not sense the difference between the originals and the duplications, other than his own unique threads making up their existence in place of their pitiful souls. A dark essence instead residing within them, but even trained eyes, he would discover. Only supremely gifted entities could detect his presence, but he would not find this out for quite some time. So he stood, with a prime now to his name, as well as a fallen prime, now the one and only true daemonic prime, his true home and residence of his anti-hosts. To this he held the growing power of a vast demonic plane, his staging ground for assaults upon the rest of daemonkind. Yes, he had what he needed to begin his campaign of growth, of power, and set about using his taken daemonic powers and knowledge to open minute rifts into as many primes as he could. The rifts were imperceptible to all but the most magical of creatures, and he waited to see what would happen, using them to feel the edges of these places tentatively, to gauge the level of power, the gradients of magic flowing through them, and identify the connections to that which he had touched. He used this information to judge where he was in relation to the other places he had witnessed when he had seen the map of existence itself, but discovered that chrylsis had not been idle while he had been locked away. He had in fact moved the map somewhat, tipping the scales in the favour of the primes, drawing them away from his reach. But he had underestimated his cunning and his power, and so he began to map the newly arranged existence as well as he could. In his spider-like webs of magical threads that spread out from this devastated prime, he discovered beings of great power, some rivaling that of some of the demonic ones he had taken into himself, and he began to watch and learn. He saw immense creatures of scales and beings of elemental stone, formed of the elemental energies of those planes themselves, living and existing in harmony upon some of the primes. He had to see these creatures, to touch them, to feed upon them, to be able to create them. And so he turned his attention to one of the primes that held some of these fantastical creations, and watched them intently with wonder, but most of all, with hunger. Eventually he discovered that some upon this prime could sense his probing of their realm, and some took an inquisitive look to his threads. He soon found himself staring back at the representatives of this prime, and communication began with them. They wished to know what he was, for they could sense he held demonic energies, but also sensed that he had what they referred to as the touch of the divine about him. They reasoned that perhaps he was a fallen god that had been trapped in the wars of another prime, whilst combating the demonic forces of the source, and that he needed their aid to escape his prison. He could not believe his fortune. To find creatures so easily swayed, so willing to help him escape this prison of his own creation. So he accepted and worked with them, and within the space of a century or so, they erected a huge temple with which to draw energies from the demonic plane he was trapped in, and allow them to attune a portion of their own prime to it, thereby allowing him to step through and take his rightful place back upon a prime, where he could then contact the Divine Ones and return to them once more. Of course, he was not going to tell them that was what he wanted, but not for the reasons they held. They were unwittingly sending him home to the host, back to chrylsis, and this pleased him. Before he entered their prime, however, he allowed his magics to permeate their realm, so he could detect others touching their prime, only to discover that they had a few temples to gods that no longer seemed to be present upon their realm. Upon completion of the gateway, he stepped through, and they looked on in awe at his sheer power, his divine form. To them, he was truly a lost god. They asked questions of his origins, where he had hailed from, who he was, and it was then he realized he did not know. He knew of his origins, of course, and how he came to be, but the simple question threw him into a stunned silence. He did not have a name, an identity to others. The large-scaled creature explained to him over many days that he must have had a name. How else could he have gleaned his power from the connection between his followers and his places of worship, and ultimately communication from above with the others of divine form? He slowly understood that those upon the primes, those who were not as he, immortal, had short lives, and seemed to, for some reason, tie their existence to various hosts. So this was where they got their power from the very life upon the primes themselves. He had yet another goal, a way to weaken his foes, to take something from them. But yet he wondered, could he be worshipped as they, and in turn gain what they themselves had? Could he gain power from a following, from the fealty of lesser creatures? What did they call it? Ah yes, a priesthood. The Scaled One introduced him to others of their kind, also scaled, and immense in stature, and they announced they had all paid fealty at one time to a divine host, but the divinity of the realm vanished as the sky shook and the stars went out, leaving them with very few lights in their skies at this time. Some cataclysm had taken place, and the two divine hosts that they had sworn their faith to had gone, but they kept their spirits high, and their powers honed, such as they were now without the touch of the divine gifts, but they were mere shadows of their former glory. They took him to one of their grand old temples, and this is where he saw a familiar sight. A host he knew all too well, for it was among the ones he had taken within him in his attack upon them. He now knew the devastation his actions had caused, and for a moment he realized the impact of his actions, as fast and as simple as they were, upon the primes that had relied upon those hosts for guidance, for power, and in some cases, he wagered, for their very existence. They tried to divine his name, as he was clearly in need of this knowledge, but they could not find one, as the divination showed his own divinity was unique, untouched by the ceremonies and initiations they had learnt about in their time upon the prime, and came to reason that he had for some reason been cast out from the divine before this could be done, before he became a true member of their kind, and they asked if he had any memory of this. He merely answered that he knew not who he was, nor why he was. He kept them at bay while his magic seeped into the realm slowly. But he discovered that demonic energies from the portal acted so very slowly here, as this prime somehow seemed to push back, almost resisting being permeated. It would be a long time if he let things take their natural course, but he could wait, for now at least. He spent many, many years with them, learning in the conventional manner, talking, interacting, and realizing that these creatures knew far more than he could ever glean merely by taking their bodies. He had to gain this information firsthand, and with this simple realization, he now knew how he must move forward. He asked if it was possible for this initiation ceremony to be completed, so he could take his place with the host, or as they put it, the divine. They said they knew of ways and hidden places around existence, but that although they themselves were extremely well versed with many differing magics and divine secrets, they could not themselves perform such a task. However, some of their kinds had left to traverse the planes, and they knew some who might hold such knowledge, and so they reached out and contacted their kin upon these places and other primes. He took advantage of these links they established to put forth the seeds of his own magic, planting a thread or two upon each of these places so he could sense their locations in future times, so as not to alert the denizens directly of his presence. This went on for many years, until finally replies had been given from most of the scattered brethren, and it seemed that they must contact the Old Ones, known to their kind as the First. Discussions were had about these creatures, these First, and all he could gather was that these Scaled Ones knew of their existence, but had never directly contacted them before. These creatures were said to be entities of great power and intellect, who had harnessed the very power of the demonic planes, as well as the nature of the divine itself. Yet they were themselves, although according to myth, immortal. They were in fact born of the true prime, the first prime, the original place where life had willed itself into being from the cacophony of power from all the planes that had touched it. This place had no known location, and it was said it was the central nexus of all primes, with all primes being in some small part created from a portion of this one true prime. It was also said that this prime was in contact with every plane of existence, and yet from what he had seen, he knew nothing of such a place. For when he looked across existence from the host's place of seeing, he had seen no indication of such, but he did not tell them this. He was then told by one of the younger Scaled Ones that it was theorized that this place had been taken by the demonic source at some point in the past, and since then had vanished from the touch of all. Another Scaled One offered forth the theory that this place had severed its contacts with all other primes in order to protect its sanctity in future times, to keep it pure and untouched, eternally without taint or subversion. And other ideas were mulled over and passed forth, but all made his head spin and left him somewhat confused, but at least he now had possibilities. There could potentially be a prime where all of the planes touched, and where even the demonic source itself could potentially be traversed to. This idea intrigued him, and he swore to them he would test this out if he ever got the chance to find such a place. It was safe to say he had started to grow content with these talks, with the presence of others around him, of an uneasy peace within him. These lesser creatures believed he was an unknown, and truly had no memory, and he would let them think this as long as it served his purposes, all the while his threads reaching out from their realm, prying further into the planes that touched their own. Time passed by quietly, until one of the threads he seeded upon a plane where the Scaled Ones had contacted had vanished from a realm he had placed it within. He reached out slowly to that place and let his power flow back there, only to find something waiting on the other side. Something familiar yet foreign to him. Something that felt, well, like him. He quickly explained to the scaled ones that he could sense something upon the place where they had contacted, and they were puzzled by his admission of such powers. They opened a small rift to this prime, allowing them to peer through, to question their envoy within this realm. But they were confronted with a terrible sight of carnage, devastation, utter annihilation of the realm that lay before them. He peered through their rift and could sense immediately himself again, and asked that they open the rift so he could enter and discover what had happened there. They reasoned it was a bad idea, but his demands were eventually met, with the rift being enlarged so he could step through. And as he did, he felt the magic wash over him. A daemon was here, and it was truly a powerful one, beyond anything he had felt before, and it was feeding. He examined the threads of the prime he now stood upon, and he could see the daemon's imprint slowly corrupting this realm, absorbing the magic that flowed across the land and replacing it with his own demonic energies. It was his, but yet was somehow not. He drew a portion of it to him and pulled it apart, stripping it thread by thread, unwinding it, unravelling the intricacies, and identifying each portion of it, examining the powers this daemon had, and could find nothing. No ability to fling forth demonic energies, or manipulate the realm upon which he stood. No ability to command his legions, like him. No legions of minions, in fact. This was a single entity. No way to take it by subversion, and no way to surreptitiously pull the demonic plane out from under his control, as the corruption of the land was happening, and the power absorbed was flowing toward one spot. The place where the fires and clouds of thick smoke and dust could be seen, with intense lightning writhing all around, accompanied by the deafening sounds of rending stone. It could have been mistaken for a volcano erupting, but he knew better. From behind him the scale ones watched from the relative safety of their prime. They asked if he needed their aid, but he declined, and told them he would contact them when the fight was over, as he did not wish to lose his newfound friends. They understood, and wished him in all his divinity a successful exploration, and then sealed the rift, leaving a tether for him to request a recall when he was ready to return. He followed the flow of magic, pulling at threads and taking them into himself as he moved. It was indeed of his own kind. No, it was actually of himself. This meant that this daemon, whatever it was not only like him, it essentially was him. Could it be that he had found his source, or perhaps even a lesser of him that he had no knowledge of? He would find answers from this daemon, and he would no longer be alone in his existence. Finally, an entity his equal to share his power and knowledge with. As he approached, he saw a sight he had no former experience of. A colossal manifestation of power that was beyond reasoning. Limbs of such size and strength. He had never realized his kind could be so large. All of the confrontations he had been a part of had ended with him fighting entities several times his size. This was true. But this daemon, this power, was like nothing he had witnessed before. The head, if that was what it was nestled beneath so many protrusions of spines and spikes that it was hard to make out, and the neck of this form was long and thick. It was so immense it was beyond his scale to reason. Even the scale ones were nothing more than the size of his hand in comparison, and they were by all his travels considered to be very large. But this thing had hands, well, clawed implements, that were covered in thorny spikes that could be considered hands, that could crush a scaled one with ease. All around it magic was flowing, circling in a maelstrom, twisting and tearing apart as it fed upon the shredded reality of this prime, feeding hungrily as once he had upon the hosts. And he felt the voices for the first time in many years, pushing forth, urging him to feed with his brethren. This creature was easily the size of the huge stone formations that creatures built their cities in the shadows of, usually topped with the white, soft ice that fell at times from the skies on some primes. He had seen this upon the prime he had just left, and was still in awe at the sheer size of this daemon. And as soon as he got to the edge of the maelstrom, it acknowledged his presence with a simple gaze and nod. He stood and watched as it fed, unsure whether to feed or not, but the voices within demanded, and as he wrestled with them, the daemon turned to him, and its voice roared across the landscape. "Feed, lost one! Feed!" He opened up his host, and allowed his essence to draw some of the maelstrom in, and was lost in the ecstasy of what he felt. The raw power of a prime, ripped apart, shredded to its purest form, and drawn into him. A sustenance that was, in comparison, to the taste of the host themselves, only there was so much more of it here, and he began to feed hungrily. The daemon watched him, and approached, to get a closer look, and spoke again, only this time with a more angry tone. "You are me, but how is this possible? There is only one of me. It is my gift." He stopped feeding, as his demonic side felt the rage directed towards him by this colossus. "I bear you no ill. I too wish to know who I am, and who you are. Are we not one of the same? A lesser form, and their greater?" The daemon let out a blast of rage towards him, sending him spinning across the landscape, tossed around like a rag doll, till he steadied his mind and stopped his motion. "No! I am the one, the only. This was my gift from the source, that I would be his champion. You are a falsity." "So why do I bear your power, your mark, your imprint? Why are you I, and I you?" The daemon stopped and moved to surround him, but he moved quickly to keep it at a safe distance, if there was such a thing, and it stopped moving altogether. "You should not be. Let us see what you are. Show me your true name." "It wants my true name?" "How can I tell you what I do not know?" he shouted back to it. "Give me your essence. Let me see what you are. You have seen me, and this is why you are here. Now show me your kind, so I may decide your fate." He reasoned simply that he was not touchable by this daemon, no matter its power, as he was after all on a prime, and within a host body. So he opened up and drew a small part of his essence from within, and let it flow through the air. The daemon looked at this thread, and as he did, took it in his own magic, and started to pull it apart, but in doing so realized something was wrong, very wrong, and shed a portion of its energies, moving back from the drawn thread. "You are the one that was gifted," it uttered. The maelstrom began to slow as he stopped feeding, his attention focused now upon him. "You are the one that has seen the host, has walked with the divine. You are the destroyer." He noticed that it was slowly gathering the power it had been channeling into the realm, back into itself, as though protecting itself. "You are my missing part, the part the source refused to gift to me. We were supposed to be one. We were supposed to be me. You took my power." And with that the skies rained down, the earth shook and upturned, and it all came his way, at once, in one realm-shattering strike. Against another daemon, this would have been very effective. Against him, however, it was a hindrance at best, for the host shell protected him from all mundane forms, as well as the demonic. So he just stood his ground, as it bore down on him through the storm of bodies, buildings, trees and stone that rained down upon him. It then began rending at his form, and despite its immense power, it could merely hold him, nothing more, as he stood his ground and bore the brunt of the attacks. This continued for many strikes, until the daemon realized he could not harm him. Not here, at least. Not upon the Prime.
I will take what was meant to be mine, but not this day. You cannot take my power, as we are the same. And were you to open your essence to me again, I would rend it from that shell and leave you a husk destroyer.
Why do you call me destroyer? He asked, finally having his attention without claws and spikes flying.
Because of what you did to your own kind. You consumed their identities, their very essences. You removed their gifts from all existence. You tore them apart, unraveled their magic.
Their threads?
Yes! You destroyed their identities, their very essence. They are gone, forever, never to return. And it's all because of you!
I did not know. The daemon part of me. It has a hunger that will not quiet.
We all have that hunger, you fool!
But I have tasted the host.
You have what?
The daemon's voice now trembled, but not with anger or rage. I have killed many of the host, what some call the divine, in the very place where they reside. And you know what? It was easy for me. He let the words sink in. And since that time, I have never found anything to quell that hunger, the voices within me that demand I feed. The host can keep them at bay, but you see, the primes are also able to give me the same satiation, as you have shown me this day in your maelstrom.
The host is mine to destroy. It is what I was created for.
And yet I am better suited, brethren. They stood watching each other intently for a time, each waiting for the next action from the other.
So, I will leave this prime to your whim, destroyer. But when next we meet, I will dethrone your power, on my terms. For without your divinity, your host-crafted shell, you are nothing more than another daemon on which to feast. And now I have seen your threads, I know how to protect myself from you. But tell me, you cannot create, can you? Where are your minions? I choose not to, and the source gifted me accordingly. So my power is absolute. But what is yours?
He smiled. Oh, my power? I have none. None at all. Well, none of my own. I do, however, have all those that I have taken. The daemon looked on and nodded in understanding.
Ah, you are a thief of others. A doppelganger.
He shook his head. Oh no, you don't understand. I have all their powers. And with that, he began to channel forth a minion, their identity taking shape, and becoming one of the fallen host he had taken. The daemon began to back away, realizing that this was actually a creature of divinity. But this was not possible.
How?
He started, but the minion's host turned his hand towards him and pushed forth a dark magic, a demonically charged blast of divinity, a chaotic force of unbelievable power, of impossible origins, and it struck home, searing clear through the top few feet of the manifestation, and causing searing pain to the daemon itself.
You have made an enemy of my will this day, Destroyer, and you will feel the sting of my spines, you abomination.
With those words, a rift of energy wrapped itself around the immense bulk of the daemon, and within seconds it vanished, leaving a swath of destruction where it had been. He stood alone upon this prime, amidst the devastation. He had met another of him, or at least near enough to be of him, and it had been a glorious sight. But he had also learned an important fact. It feared his power, and somehow he had perverted the powers of the divine in the blast he had unleashed, and this intrigued him. This should not be so. But as he examined his threads, he noticed something strange. His daemonic part, his true self, had changed, albeit in a small manner. It had been infused with the prime, a large amount of such raw power, and he had never felt it before. The prime was not of demonic origins, but formed of the hosts themselves, with infusion and imparting from other planes of existence. Could it be that in the act of infusing himself with this power, and his unique origins as they were, that he had somehow birthed a new magic, a new power? It was something that equaled the host's own, but with far darker origins, and he would come to realize this power in time, as he flexed his newfound prowess and began to leech more of this prime into his form. He spent many years absorbing this prime, and several times small rifts began to open from other daemons wishing to join in the feast, but as they appeared, he sucked the rifts dry, blocking their access, preventing them from taking what was his. This power would be his and his alone, and it would grant him a reservoir of raw energy with which to make his goals a reality. Once he had drained the entire prime and taken it into himself, the host shell, his very divine essence, cracked and split like some gigantic insect carapace. His true form grew to contain this new level of power, and as it solidified, the power of his divinity settled into its new host. This was how the other daemon had become so large, and as he flexed his new form, he realized it was so much more powerful than before, in both demonic force as his threads grew and multiplied from the magic he had taken as he had sucked the prime dry, and divine power gleaned from the very prime itself as it was broken down and absorbed into his shell. It was then, after this span of time, that he turned his attention back to the prime from which he had traversed, to the place of the scaled ones. He found that he did not need to ask them to open a rift, as his new levels of magic allowed him to effortlessly create a pathway, his threads chasing to his destination and fording a channel through the flows of the plains between. As he arrived in their realm, he did not recognize it at first. It was barren instead of lush, and the mountains were bare and ashen, the sky a dreary tone of grey, and not a tree could be seen where there should be vast forests. Am I in the right place? His thoughts slowed as he tried to make sense of the view, but it was as he allowed his threads to explore that he realized what had happened, and rage began to build within him. His threads had touched a scaled one, or rather what was left of it, torn asunder, ripped apart by magics he had not known until this encounter on the other prime. The daemon who called him brethren had been here, and he had done this. Whether to anger or remove aid, he did not know, nor care, as for the first time he felt loss, true loss. These creatures had been his only friends, if he could call them that. They had treated him with kindness despite his heritage, his form. They had taken him in and nurtured his understanding of the planes, of the realms, had taught him about the primes and histories, and helped him unlock the secrets of some of his power. This brethren would pay, and pay with his very essence. He would strip it, remove every thread from the planes, destroy every vestige of his power, from the very primes themselves. This daemon would know pain, fear, and terror before he was removed from existence. This was his first true anger, his taste of unbound rage, and it fueled his lust for power for millennia to come. He spent the next time, of which was a great span, searching the demonic planes for answers, for the true home of this daemon, but none knew of it. Those who refused to answer became one with his threats, and then he learned their truths, growing as he did. Those who aided him became his envoys, but in time his magics corrupted their threats and turned them to his own side. It seemed as his power grew, his corrupting influence began to seep from his form without great concentration on his part, as though his demonic side was vying for control, for power, for the opportunity to spread like a plague across the threads of magic and reality that it encountered. He began to be known as the Scourge for a time by his own kin, as everything he touched eventually turned, decayed, and became one with him. With this realization, the daemons pulled back from contact with him, as eventually just the mere meeting with him was enough for a thread to become tainted, and if not cut out, would spread throughout their forms, their lands, and their vassals. But in all his travels and all his conquests, he could find no trace of this brethren, nor could he find anyone who could point him in the direction of those that the Scaled Ones had tried to contact on his behalf. And then something unexpected occurred. A message for him, written in the very threads themselves, guiding him to a meeting place. By now his place of origin was a beacon of power within the vastness of the planar landscape, and although they could sense it, and some could even see it, none would dare venture close, as the taint of his threads permeated all who touched, and none would do so willingly. However, those of the Prime knew nothing of this, as they could not see or sense from where they sat. This power grew unknown to their kinds, hidden from the host. He wanted this. In fact, he needed it, in order to return and dethrone them, take their power, and finish what he had begun. But this message puzzled him. It was from within the planes themselves, deeper than he knew or had seen, as though the very essence of magic itself was leading him somewhere. And so he ventured and journeyed deeper into the demonic realms than any of his kind had ventured in aeons. This place was so deep and thick with magic, permeating evil beyond measure, and here, despite his body being of the host, and immensely more powerful than it had been when he first ventured out, he could feel it slowly eroding his form. He had not known this place existed, and he had seen all of existence, all of the planes, all that the host could see. Of course, this was beyond their sight, in the same ways their own plane was beyond the sight and reach of daemonkind. In fact, he doubted they even knew of this place, as he slowly pushed his way through the thick threads that tried to crush and hold him, to prevent his movement onward. Here the threads were so tightly packed that they were like cloth was to stone. Threads moved at his command, or were brushed aside by his touch under normal conditions, and even the deepest planes he had been to had been little more than pushing his way through what would equate to water at most to those of the living kind. But this was like pushing a way through a thick liquid, perhaps somehow walking through sand up to his torso, or swimming through tar. Perhaps other ways to explain it could be found, but his experience of reality had been sparse. But none other than he had been here. At least none from the primes, he would wager. How wrong he was. As he forged further, deeper, the threads became like stone, unmoving, unrelenting in their pressure to prevent his movement, and he paused for a moment to gather his power, to try to force the threads to move to his will. But he noticed something else. His threads could not pierce the threads here. They were unable to coerce them to his will, and try as he might, he could not see the nature of these threads, as they refused to bend to his will, and the deeper he moved, the weaker he found himself becoming, as the host-given shell grew weaker. Then, without warning, the threads parted, and he fell for a great distance, through a space almost devoid of thread, where he could only sense the hint of such circling at distance from him. And he knew he had pushed past this barrier. But into what? Now, that was the question. As he fell, he became aware of a presence, unlike any he had yet felt. He felt the life of the prime rife within this creature, and the depths of daemonhood too, but also the spark of divinity upon its soul. But not how his felt. This was a purity of form and power, shaped and wielded, not worn like his own, and the power was seemingly faint, yet strong at the same time. It confused his senses, and his threads could not find anything to move towards, or grasp hold of to gain purchase and discover more. "You have come. I knew you would," the voice boomed out, yet surrounded him. Neat trick, he thought, as he still wrestled with his power to try and push out and feel his surroundings. "You cannot do that here, and nor would I wish you to, so please, stop, before you run your strength down to that of a newling." He felt himself slowly being lowered toward a rough platform, a slowly spinning chunk of what felt like prime under his feet, and landed on it almost gently. A good distance from him, on another such chunk of prime, a towering robed figure stood, of great stature. Yet this creature was unknown to him, but seemed to look as though it bore markings from every daemon he had known of, and every host he had ever seen, and more. "You are a mortal creature?" he asked. "Yes, and no. If you mean, am I alive? Then yes, and no. And if you mean I will succumb to age and die of decay and the passage of time, then also yes, and no." He talks and makes no sense, he thought. "Why did you ask me to come here?" "I asked you here to see that you were as had been arranged, and I am both elated and disappointed by what lies before me." "I am a disappointment to you?" He could feel his daemon rage starting to build at these words. "Yes, for you were to be the one, to unite them all, as I had been the first to understand them all. But it seems that chrylsis failed once more, and now you walk the plains, devouring, destroying, and plotting against your kin." It adjusted its stance, and he could see this creature was not just a bipedal creature, a gigantic man-thing, if you will, but it had many arms, each covered in markings unknown to him, as tattoos, scars, perhaps magical patterning, sigils, glyphs perhaps. He did not understand what he was seeing, but as it moved several of its arms, he could see and feel the ebb and flow of many types of magic around it, and knew this was a being of great mastery, and it would seem a degree of such even over his kind. "I have seen the birth of the gods, one and all, of the seeds of the daemon kind spawn and spread forth through the ether like a never-ending plague of magical origins. The source gifts life to your kind, and chrylsis gives life to the others of what you know now as the divine. And between you and they, the unaligned planes reside, with their own eternal neutrality, forever weaving their blessings and imbuing what they touch with their own uniqueness. And then, upon the places taken from the prime of existence, prime realms are formed, and there your kind pierce the veil, and wage war upon the hosts and their creations, in a never-ending cycle of attrition and death beyond imagining. And yet the prime allows it, despite all your kind's attempts to subvert it to your own ends, for the prime is eternal. It was here before you, and will be here long after your hosts lose their lights, and your essences are drawn into one singular darkness, and fall beyond the scope to reach the prime again. They paused for a moment, and turned their full attention back to him. And then it will begin anew. This creature knew more than he could imagine. But what was it? It was no daemon, no god, no prime creature he had ever seen, and yet somehow it held all three aspects of reality. And then he remembered what the Scaled Ones had told him, of one who had been born the first of all, upon the prime, and turned his hand to the prime and the hosts as well as the source. You are him, aren't you? The last of the ones the Scaled Ones told me of. He felt a warmth come from the creature, and it answered. Yes, I knew the Scaled Ones you saw the demise of well, for I taught them what they needed to know to survive when the lights of the gods were taken from them. He felt a coldness sweep past him, despite being able to actually feel such things. By one born of the source and host. Had they known you had done this, they would never have aided you, never have shown you the ways of their kind, of their magics, and you would never have met the Spined One, and you would never have gained an insight into anger, rage, and loss. You owe them more than you realize. He looked on, and tried to fathom how this creature could know these things, but before he could speak, it continued. And now you seek the spine for revenge, the source for payback of some kind you believe you deserve, the hosts for, sport it would seem, and anything that gets between you and your whims, as more power means more knowledge, and more knowledge means more power, and so the cycle will continue until you are all, or you are. It paused, letting the words sink in before finishing with, stopped. It took some time before he acknowledged the words he heard, and controlled his building rage, as he was too weak from the travel to even consider fighting this creature, and he had a feeling that this thing wielded more than he could comprehend. He must learn before he confronted it. Stop me how, may I ask? Simply put, if you do not stop yourself, your own actions will stop your advance, and eventually be your downfall. For as you once rose from the source, as some of your kin do, you also fell from the host, also as some do. And when all is said and done, that which is not part of you will be your undoing. He drew himself up, standing proud in the face of this towering creature, and as he tried to speak, it motioned with many of its hands, and as they moved, they traced visible magic across the air between them. He never knew this was possible, to see the threads in pure form, as something tangible to eyes not of divine or daemon kind. And as he watched, almost mesmerized by these actions, he was hit by a force so hard he reeled and was engulfed by immense pressure from all around, as he was sent speeding through the thickened threads he had traversed. In short time he found himself weakened of demonic power and drained of his divine reserves, but in a place he knew well. The plane he had made his own private battleground, that of his first demonic conquest. His anger could wait, for he needed to regain his strength, and he did so by taking that which he created into himself slowly, bathing in it, and slowly rejuvenating his reserves, all the while thinking on this creature. He knew not its name, its identity, its kind, nor its plane of residence. It had shown it had the power to toss him around like a rag doll, should he confront it within the depths of the demonic. Well, what should he call it? He had nothing to draw from, but decided to call it the place of solid threads for now, until he could discover what the place really was. He also needed to know more of his kind, both origin sides, for this creature was a threat to him, as was the spined one, as he had called it. And he needed to regain his power and make his plans now to include this new factor. Time flowed by, and he gleaned all that he could from his threats as he let them explore the planes where he waged his wars. He learned of other primes, many bursting at the seams with life, magic, and links to the hosts, and for a time he looked to these places for power and possible information on those who would threaten him. He had started to wage wars against many planes at once, using his Dark Host duplicates to do his bidding, with them acting as conduits for his power, and each of them being gifted a spark of his own, so they may also duplicate those lesser creatures that they would slay or take into their fold. This was where the great planar war began, as this was when the primes would once more become aware of his presence and his now growing power. He sought out a plane that would be a single forward power base to launch his spearhead from, and he took it swiftly. These daemons merely had dropped towards his now vast and growing power. He chose this place as it was close to the prime he was targeting, and also because for some reason someone had left him an open portal of permanence to use for his assault. He would not give such an opportunity up easily. This prime had a myriad of heroes upon it, as well as their adversaries. He decided not to announce his presence immediately, as he sat and witnessed the sheer power of the host's own believers here, and was taken aback by their competence in wielding their gifts. They could actually prove challenging, he mused, as he slowly looked around. Taking a lesser life, a young child born of magic, he walked the lands where the child had been born. This place was strange, with a mass of sentient life like he had never seen, and a background level of pure magic that was unlike anything he had ever felt since his reckoning with the spine. Yes, he should walk among them before he would wage war here. He tried to manifest his powers to protect this vessel, but discovered that, although his essence could pass into this prime, he could not summon a tether to his host shell, thereby meaning that as he walked here, his true self residing within his host would never know what he knew, unless he returned to it so it could absorb what he had discovered. It was a strange feeling to have left his body, drifting almost lost in this tiny mortal shell of sinew and blood, not knowing what was transpiring where he had left his host. It took a while for him to realize that this must be how those who were slain must feel, no longer having a place to reside, merely floating away from what they knew, no longer having their anchor to their realm. He did not enjoy this feeling. He felt vulnerable. He also discovered that this creature was getting harder to control the longer he spent from the host, and after a week or so of time in this prime, he felt he needed to return to renew the power he felt falling from him, as his threads were not strong enough to control it for too long. As he re-entered his host, the shell he had created went back to the world, devoid of purpose, but in time he would be able to implant purpose to them, giving them a drive to serve and spread his threads. This he had to do if he was to accomplish anything here where the ambient magic was far greater than his own tethers, where he could not manipulate the weave as easily as he normally could. But why? Why could he not do so? His drone shell wandered the world for a month or two, and when it returned, it brought with it the news of many things it had heard. But he needed definitive answers to specific questions. But these duplications could not think for themselves, so he would have to wait. Perhaps wait until he found something that would work for him for payment, perhaps, as this seemed the way of beings of the primes. Years passed, and he slowly took enough native shells to number 40. These would form his spearhead of information gathering, as limited as it was at present. He needed to capture more useful creatures, as these farmers, peasants, and dying miscreants, as unseen as they were by the societies they infiltrated, were ultimately nothing more than silent zombies, unthinking, and merely gathering minor facts about the immediate area. He needed one of the followers of a host, what they called a priest. Yes, one of these would be perfect, as then he could gain vast information on their very gods. And so he sought a priest out, a lowly one that might be missed. He travelled himself in created shell, and in quick time he found one. He was dressed in black, and hid himself from others around him, much like those he had already taken. And so, in a darkened alley, he approached this creature. As he neared, it turned to him, and he saw it as one of those known to the Prime as a human. He had seen them seeded throughout the primes he had spied upon thus far, and seemed to be one of the most proliferate of races around, spreading their numbers much like him, although slower, across their realms.
"Greetings! Could I be of assistance to you, sir?"
it said, addressing him as he approached.
"Do you seek aid?"
Too easy, he thought, as he drew closer to him. "Yes, I seek information on your god." A smile crept across his face.
"Oh, you wish to meet him?"
it said, as though it was a simple matter. "Why, yes," he said, and stood in front of his quarry, waiting for what he needed to do, ready to follow his new-found friend.
"He is this way,"
it said, motioning him down the crooked alley. He smiled and nodded. "Thank you, friend," beginning to walk the path as directed. "This was too easy, and soon I shall find—" and with that his body shot through with pain. Looking down, he could see a sliver of metal protruding from his chest.
"You shall see him soon enough,"
the voice said, shrieking with glee as its possessor drew the blade from him and plunged it again and again into his back. The pain was great, but strangely comforting. He could not feel within his host, but in this body he could actually experience such sensations. The point of the piercing of the skin, the puncturing of the flesh, and the pain of his sinew and organs being sliced, and it was a joyful thing to him. He turned to his assailant, smiling, and mouthed the words, "Thank you," as he realized this shell could no longer stand, as blood gushed from the wounds, and the body crumpled slowly. It stood over him, still smiling, but shocked at his reaction.
You felt nothing?"
And it nudged him gently with his foot. He tried to respond, but found he could not speak, and as he tried, he just spat out the blood that was filling his lungs and mouth. These meat things are very frail, he noted, as he lay there in the dying shell. But he realized that, although life was slipping from this shell, he was still able to observe the world around him, and he watched on as it turned him over and searched his body for something useful. It seemed happy when he discovered coins upon him, and he took them for its own, leaving his body to ebb away in a dark corner. He waited, and hours later, vermin arrived, a few at first, fighting amongst themselves for fresh pickings of this feast. Soon more came, and soon he could barely see the world, for their numbers were vast, like the creations of the demonic hordes, and then shortly he could see nothing, for his eyes were torn out and devoured. So he found he had to resort to seeing through the threads that were rapidly fading from his body. But what was this? These creatures, although not of a magical nature themselves, actually carried magic. Of course, the ambient levels of this place meant there was a possibility that all creatures were held with at least some magical power, as it permeated them throughout their lives, flowing through the realms unseen to the lower forms of life. He reached out to one of them, and found it was easy to control. So, although he could not duplicate them, as he was not with his host, he could jump bodies and see the world through the eyes of the lesser creatures, or perhaps head back and gain a more useful body. He would see more first. These creatures, rats as he understood them, ran through the city, heading from meal to meal, from corpse to dropped snack, and opportune kills, with the rest of the pack. Host? Pack? Swarm? He would have to learn the correct terms for these things at some point, but for now, he needed to ride the body back to the host. He discovered that his threads were actually too much power for this creature, and slowly it began to falter and decay, as the sheer power of the elevated magic within it was far too high for its body to hold, and it started to break down and disintegrate. Quickly he shifted his power to another of the pack, and started to herd it back to the host portal. He now knew that the lesser creatures could be used to escape capture, ride forms with, and spy where the larger sentient ones could not approach. This could come in useful, he was sure, if he could find a way to utilize it, as it appeared the denizens of the realms either ignored them or tolerated their presence, as the numbers were insurmountable, and the fact of being was an accepted one. As he reached the host and placed his threads back within it, he felt the many become one once more, as all the threads he held within knitted together again and absorbed the knowledge. Now all threads knew what this thread had known, and this is how he must continue. Scout, run, report, over and over, until he was ready. But first, he had a score to settle. Once ready, and with the passage of a few days, he sought out his quarry, in the dark alley where he had been slain prior, and sure enough, it was there once more, and he approached it slowly. "Hello, friend." It looked up, slowly, the colour draining from its face as it saw the one it killed but a few nights prior stood there before him once again. He could feel the fear rising in it, and smiled broadly as it tried to run. He leapt forward and grabbed its wrist. "You said you would show me your god." It shook with fear as it clawed at his hand, trying to release the grip, but soon discovered that it was futile, and sagged visibly with resignation. "Help!" it shouted suddenly, as though it had realized a strategy that would save it from this madman. "Help! Mugger!" He threw his body into the one who had slain him, and crushed the wind out of his lungs as it slammed into the wall. "You owe me a god," he said, still smiling. It tried to speak, but found a hand clamped across its face tightly, cutting its voice from the night air, and it then became aware of the voice. It began in its head and seemed to echo around the alley. Run. Seek help. It froze for a second, and then elation hit. "He has heard my calls!" And it found a renewed vigor. The man who held him tight began to relax his grip, and it tried to shove him away. As the grasp on the wrist slipped, it felt the arm go limp, and the body was pushed easily away, allowing it to knock him to the ground. "You aren't getting up this time!" it said, pulling a pair of knives from its boot and setting to work on his chest, neck, and face. All that was left was more food for the rats. He looked from his new vantage point, slightly taller than he was used to, and spoke again. "Good work. Now quickly, before he rises again." It nodded to the night and ran into the darkness, through several tunnels and holes, doors, several windows, eventually resting outside a large, heavy-set door, with strange markings upon it. As it gathered its breath, it gasped,
"Thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to fight that thing off."
"It was nothing. Now take me home." And it nodded, rapping upon the door of the huge building crafted from a strange black stone. The door opened slowly, and a guard stood in metal and leather, and nodded, allowing it in. It walked through a few corridors, stopped at an imposing robed figure who gestured to a small chamber, and left it there. Within the room lay several small stools, a table, a few stiff-looking cushions, and a small altar of offering. This was it, he thought, looking intently at the altar. Finally, I can see what it is they do. And he waited. It knelt in front of the altar, lowering its head, slowing its breathing, and clearing its thoughts. As it was calmed and ready, several minutes had passed, and the faint smell of insects began to drift into the air, seemingly from the altar itself.
"Tonight I met a man who I slew the night last,"
it began, speaking slowly to the altar.
"And I did as you asked, and made sure he did not return again."
And with that he bowed his head to the floor and waited. "You were told to kill me." He thought, pondering what truths this place would hold, and waited. Nothing. No power, no threads, no contact, just nothing.
"Of course I will continue to do your bidding,"
it said, and rifled around its pockets, dropping the coins it had taken from his body the nights before into a box at the side of the altar.
"I will bring you more next time to receive your blessings again. Thank you for your aid and words this night."
He had spoken to this creature, no one else. There was nothing contacting this creature but him, and now he was with him. He would sense if anything was touching his soul or his body, but no. He sensed nothing. Something is amiss here, he mused, and waited. It stood up after a few minutes, and seemed to be waiting for something. The large robed figure that had motioned it into this room earlier entered, and picked up the box, shaking it slightly. A nod was given, and a sense of relief was felt from the figure as it left the chamber. Wait, was this it? Those coins were all they were bothered about. But he had said he had heard... Oh. It looked into a bowl of water on the table, and as it did, it saw not what he had seen, but something else. It saw an image that it did not, an image of a stronger creature, a more confident creature. It thought it was something it was not, and all because of its belief in this altar, or whatever it was representing. It made no sense, but then it dawned on him. I spoke to it, and it thought I was the one it served. And he smiled. It did not know. It could not distinguish between me and a voice that, by the look of it, it had never known. They were manipulated this easily. Well, this could even be fun. Well done, he said to it, and it blinked the water from its eyes as it washed its face.
"You are still with me?"
it asked, slowly, shocked by getting another voice. "Oh yes, I am with you until your end." Oh, how much fun this could be. The power to make it do as he wanted, and all because it thought he was a greater power. Not that he was not, but that it thought he was whatever this thing he followed was. "Tell me my name, believer," the voice said in its head, and it nodded to the altar and stood straight as though being observed by a superior.
"Your name is Arnosh, god of the dark paths, of the night."
He sought this knowledge, and knew nothing of such a host, although more could have been spread than he knew of course, and there were more primes than he had seen too. Perhaps this was a true host. He would need to find this one, and take it. "Come, I will guide you to a truth of the night, but you must hurry, for if light breaks the day, you will never find it." He laughed inwardly as it jumped, looking around frantically.
Where? Where do you need me to go?
It shouted, spinning around, shouting to the ceiling, and then the altar. It felt the voice seemingly smile from within him, and it felt it had been touched by the very gods themselves. He led it through the streets, back where it had passed that night, as it was the only route he knew, and past the scene of his would-be demise earlier and previously. The rats had been here already. Eventually, an out-of-breath human happened upon a ramshackle hut, beneath which lay a long-forgotten cave system, and within this system lay a portal to the last place it would ever know. Exhausted, it collapsed just outside the hut, watching the night slowly slipping from above, and the first rays of light threatening to breach the slowly lightening sky. On your feet and quickly now, before the light touches you.
Of course, sorry,
it said, as it slowly dragged its panting body into the hut, and then through the tunnels, guided by an unnatural vision that it did not possess itself, as though being granted a sight beyond mere mortals. It was, just not from where it thought it was from. He had enjoyed watching this creature do his bidding, run across the city on his command, without question, and he had felt the joy, the euphoria, and the elation as it had been touched by a voice that was, to the best of its knowledge, that of its own god. Perhaps this is why they follow, and why the host allowed them to do so. And he recalled something he had been told by the great scaled ones. They follow blindly in some cases, but in almost all they follow because they see something in that deity that they wish to aspire to hold on to become one with. For some it is for betterment, and for others it is for penance, but it serves both supplicant and God. You see, the power of the gods' gift unto their followers, their believers, their armies, is also returned to them in greater portion by their supplicants' belief in them. In short, the gods give power and receive power back, and it is always the gods that gain in this pact. So this creature believed he was something it was not, and what it saw in the water was what it was aspiring to, what it believed this god was giving it. Its own mind created a belief in something that he could find no trace of. Was it even there? He would soon find out when he met in person. He led it to the portal, where it fell on its knees, and it asked,
Is this where I'm supposed to be? A demonic portal to the plains of despair?
It asked, fearing the answer that would come. Yes, I brought you here, to your truth. And with that he left it, and entered the host body, entwining with his other threads, letting them know what he knew, and then crafted a new body again, in front of this creature, and entered it once more. At the creation of that which it had now killed twice, it began to shake, its mind unable to comprehend what it was seeing, as out of nowhere the form of that which it had been slain returned, slowly as though a ghost at first, but quickly spun full form. Its mouth hung open, eyes agog, and what sanity it had been holding on to at this point, left for a time. Now see me, at least see one of my forms, he said, his voice booming through the tunnels, and it fell to its knees, shaking as it looked up at him.
You are not him!
It managed to get out the words before words were lost to its mind, as the form created finally became whole, solid, and real. No, indeed I am not your god, but I could be, he said, slowly, letting it sink into its head. He reached out and touched it with his threads, and felt the mind racing, the thoughts unable to craft properly. It could not comprehend what it was seeing, what it had witnessed, done, and now beheld at the end of its journey. Perhaps I've driven this one too far, he reasoned, and lifted his hand to point toward it, and as he was about to release threads to begin conversion of this one to his own, it spoke.
Show me,
it said, slowly, shaking the words out among its drooling gape, and it looked up in despair, waiting for the words of this unknown entity before it. He recalled again what the Scaled Ones had said about followers of faith, and the gods needing them in order to gain power above. To actually be a host, it was a necessity. Perhaps this will be a good opportunity, he thought, and responded with, "Yes, I will take you as my first supplicant upon this realm. I will gift you power, unlike your old god, and all you need do is bring me a priest of those who you worshipped before, one of those known to worship Arnosh." It nodded uncontrollably, shaking, and clearly was having problems with his form. He looked at its eyes, and then he realized he had not removed the vision he had gifted it. No wonder, it's driving him to insanity. And he touched it on the brow and removed this gifted sight. Immediately it looked calmer, as the visions abated. No more could it see the threads, the souls and the essences twisting within them, screaming for aid and clawing to escape the impenetrable power that held them within. It no longer saw a vision of total despair, and the penetrating web of threads that intertwined the tunnels and the very portal in front of him, which now looked dark, like a vertical inky water, smooth as glass. "Here," he said, passing a coin to it and pushing magic into it. "It will allow you to see in the darkest places. Consider it your first gift from your new god. And remember, give me what I ask for, and you will be rewarded for your duty." And he fixed his gaze upon it unnervingly. It drew itself to its feet and looked at him, accepting the coin.
Yes, I will."
"I only ask of you one thing, and one thing only. A portion of what you call your life, and I will use it to give you immortality within me. And for this I will gift, in the hole it will leave, I will gift you with my own power, as a god will do."
Yes, of course,"
it said, and moved forward, an arm outstretched. "Easier than I thought." He smiled and grasped it by the head, and drew all but a small part of its soul from its body, leaving enough behind for it to function and live, but so that he had all he needed from it should it die. It screamed till it lost its voice, and fell to the ground unconscious. He waited, and as he did, he lived through the old memories of this creature. It was a he, a male, a human, and he was one of 4 other brothers. His mother killed by his father, and he was the only survivor of his father's wrath for some reason he did not know. He had killed his father, then sought penance with the priesthood, but from all accounts this group of followers had never shown a propensity for magics of any kind. In fact, they seemed to be utterly without power at all. They were mere mortals, and showed no sign of the touch of the divine upon them. It had been taken in by a con artist, a charlatan, and although it half knew it, it wanted to belong, to be part of something that had a cause it could throw itself at in an attempt to earn forgiveness for its actions. He understood now. This one was a lost soul too, and it had been lied to. It followed no god, unless these coins were believed to be of a god somehow, so it could not show him its god, nor bring a priest of that cult to his grasp. But maybe he could use this, and take this small cult for his own in time. Perhaps it could be the first true priest within that lie that had caught it. Yes, he would give it the means to exact its revenge, and in doing so cement his tie to this one, and in time use it to attempt to rise back to the hosts, by means of the path the Scaled Ones had spoken of, through the rites of the ancients, and the path of the scions. It finally woke to find itself on a small patch of grass just outside its city, and remembered vividly what had transpired. For a few minutes it sat, making sense of it all, and for a brief moment thought it had merely drank too much, or taken something that disagreed with its mind. At least until, as it stood up, it felt the coin in its pocket, and as he grasped it, he could see a soft glow emanating from the world around. It was real, he thought, and reeled from the reality of it all, and began to slowly make its way to the city. It headed to the temple, where it had been the night prior, but discovered on the way that it had been gone a lot longer than a single day, 4 days in fact. As it entered through the large black doors, it was met by the robed figure again, and roughly taken by the arm and led into a back room. Hours passed by, and it emerged from the temple beaten, part broken, its face bruised, lash marks on its back and arms. It was angry, and headed to find its friends. It told them of what it had encountered, and the events of the past days, of the one it killed that then reappeared again, testing its will, and it killed it again, and that the god they knew as Arnosh was a false god, a falsity spun by a thieves' guild, and nothing more. By the time the night fell, it had 9 with it, heading to the temple. Each had been a part of his lie. Each wanted answers, payback, and worse from the so-called Temple of Arnosh. Upon arrival, vengeance was swift and decisive. No survivors, and none escaped. The Temple of Arnosh was stripped of all they could use, and all but 2 left with their gains. It turned to them and asked if they would be the second and third of the following of this new god, and they agreed to the request, and so he had started a following. It returned to the tunnels alone and reported what had transpired, and he appeared again as the one it had slain. I cannot travel to them. They must come here, for my form will be sensed by others who would cause me harm as I begin my faith anew. It nodded and accepted this half-truth, and left to bring the new disciples back. The real truths were many, but the main one that was he could not walk upon the plain, and strip the soul from a creature without causing a scene, or risking a demonic feeding frenzy, whereas here, where the veil was thin and the threads were close to his host, he could exercise complete control and do what was needed to be done. Within hours, the one was then 3, and he now had a power base on which to slowly spread. He, however, demanded that he would keep the name Arnosh, as he would give them what the false idol had not. So they kept the temple, and began anew, each with a coin in hand of strange hue. For years to come their numbers grew, and he kept gaining more souls, and hence more of an understanding, as well as control over those he gained. Any that tried to leave would find themselves visited by strange entities of darkness in the depths of night, which would whisper their darkest secrets, and force them to seek Arnosh to quell their voices. This control was simple, and so he left one of the greater threats to carry this on, as he focused his attentions elsewhere. Arnosh grew for many years upon this prime, but naturally drew the attention of followers of hosts, those of divinity, whereupon they investigated this temple of Arnosh, questioning and probing, trying to discover the truth behind them. They were invited in, and told of the events that transpired, of the deceit and the aid given by their new named saviour Arnosh. They were amazed to find a possibly unknown new divinity here that they had no knowledge of, and were eager to learn more. And so the invitation was given to one of their high priests, one known as Kotel, and he accepted eagerly to be the first to catalogue this new divinity, this hidden god. He was led to the tunnels, whereupon he would be told the great truth that had been revealed to them. By this point, the first followers of Arnosh had gained a decade, and gained many allies, and a somewhat small fortune. He had used a good portion of it to erect a watchtower and a fortified gateway to the tunnels, where the old hovel had once stood, and had stationed a mercenary group who were also true followers of Arnosh. The high priest was amazed and intrigued, and of course was more than willing to see this truth, and learn more for his own faith's records. The portal was still there, as it had been since it was first seen, inky and black, like sheer glass, and the high priest stood across the cave from it, peering in its direction. He focused his power and let out a yelp of fear.
"It is a portal to the demonic realms, you fools!"
he hissed, turning to the first one, who smiled at him knowingly.
"Yes, it is. And this god listens to us, and helps us."
And he pushed Kotel towards the portal.
"And most importantly, needed to speak with you. I have one for you, Arnash,
he cried out, and the portal rippled, sending droplets of blackness spattering around the cave, and out stepped that first form that had tormented it so many years ago. "Thank you. You will be rewarded well," he said, and turned his attention to the high priest. "And now to find some truths." And with that he grasped Kotel by the throat and lifted him several feet into the air, growing in height and stature as he did. And the first and second watched on as he started to take the truth from him, thread by bloody thread. They closed their hands around their coins and watched on in awe, wonder, and terror as they saw the blood flow, the skin tear and flay, and the limited sight they had showed the threads of magic drawn out and be shredded by their god. They were witnessing a pivotal moment in history, but they did not know it, and never would. He talked with the high priest as he slowly stripped the power from him, step by step, piece by piece, savouring the divine power he had been imbued with. Kotel pleaded with him at first, then tried to fight him with his given power, but this daemon was just too much for him, despite his ranking, and he began to realize the futility of his position. "Yes, you are mine now, and I will learn all you know, as I consume your soul, mortal," he stated, as a matter of fact, as he revelled in the first of a host's power to be given him in many centuries. But he must not kill him, for he might need him. He needed a high priest in order to enact the rites of the Scion, or the Ascension rites, or, to be truthful with himself, he needed another who knew exactly what to do, who had perhaps performed such in the past, to guide his hand in this matter. He needed this priest's soul, but needed a high priest. But maybe he could do so with this Kotel under his wing.
"No, monster, I will not do your bidding,"
Kotel screamed in his mind, for he could talk no more, as the magic being stripped from him tore away his throat, and had already been pulling out his ability to control his body. He smiled to him and assured him, his voice echoing through his mind. "No, Kotel, you will not be doing my bidding." And he waved a hand to motion threads to begin creating another form. "But your new form will do it for me." He held Kotel in front of his newly forming duplicate, so he could see, and then he pushed his demonic sight into the remnants of the priest, so he could witness the true horror of this creation, of twisted souls and demons of raw essence, and there he saw something familiar as his life finally ebbed and his consciousness was lost. His own soul. Kotel was no more, as every last part of him, magical, physical, and divine, was taken into this form. A small portion of Kotel was used, transferred from the original, that of Kotel's own soul, as without this he would not be able to commune with his host, nor use his powers. He commanded the new priest to show his power, and he tried, but announced he had none left. Of course he didn't, for he had used it trying to fight him off. He poured power into the priest, and asked again, and he gifted himself sight, as he had witnessed before. "Good," he said, and nodded to the first and second. "Take him back to the priesthood, and thank them for his truths, for he will be their undoing." And with that the three left the cave and headed back toward the city. Yes, he will indeed be their undoing, he thought, looking back toward them as they left the cave. And I shall take what this one known as Karnefos has in time. As the years passed on, the shade of Kotel infiltrated the Karnef temples effortlessly. They could not detect the change, it seemed, as they had not encountered his kind before, and therefore had no knowledge or way to detect or even be aware of such. This agent within this faith gathered a lot of important knowledge about the gods of the realm, and also about the rites, rituals, sacred places, and locations of power, and so much more. In time there came a holy day, whereupon one of the grand high priests of this priesthood came from across the realms to visit the area, and this is when he learnt of the rites he needed, as this priest became his, as Kotel had long ago. The knowledge now secured, all he needed was more agents, and so the Karnef priesthood was slowly drawn to him, one by one, and replaced by his shades, each with a sliver of their soul, so as not to arouse suspicion. This priesthood were the wardens of the dead. They were responsible for the dead of the realms, or more precisely, for the keeping of the dead, and ensuring they were not pulled back from the beyond once their times had come and the rites had been read. They were combatants of the undead, but that aside were peaceful in both war and peace times. At least as long as no one was resurrecting the dead without good reason or against their will. They were, it seemed, by all accounts, bankers of the bodies of the fallen, ensuring that once debts had been paid, they could sleep easy in their eternal rest. Of course, this was only offered to those of their number, or those who sought them out, usually for fear of something after their death, or even due to trying to keep secrets from would-be necromancers and dabblers of the dark arts. For once dead, the will to resist was little at best, but Karnef made their will indomitable. These little priests were perfect, for he could listen to all, and through their powers, which he could use through them, he could also question the dead should he need to, something he had never thought of till now. He was finally getting a foothold. Time passed, and opportunities arose. He encountered other priesthoods and other faith followers, of Ursulan and Kalanave, and also one or two others who had lost their link to the gods in times past, but kept their faith alive in the form of cults, awaiting the return of their gods one day. And then he encountered a problem. As he tried to infiltrate Ursulan, he discovered they had close ties to another, who Karnef also knew well, but rarely acted with directly. Those of Riona. Their high priest sensed something was amiss when they first met with Kotel, and even when the Grand High Priest was sent to assure her something was not amiss, she was seemingly too smart. Riona, however, was known as the Goddess of Peace, so her followers would never move against the other churches for fear of causing conflict, or so he thought. Their priestess contacted strange folk, who he would learn were those of the wild, the actual raw primal power of life upon the prime itself. He learned quickly that their priests, known as druids, were able to sense unnatural things, or rather, things that were not native to their realm, their prime, and this was a problem. Druids were brought into the city, and they began to watch the Karnef priests, and in short time they had identified many of his shades, and had begun to follow them. It would have been easier to avoid these druidic nuisances, but in the end he would have to confront them, and so he sent a small envoy, including Kotel, to their nearest circle several days outside of the city. Upon arrival they found a host of people and creatures waiting for them. Those of Karnef who were not shades were motioned forth and greeted, while others of the gathering stepped forth and approached the shades. They looked them over and asked that they all follow them to their meeting place, within their sacred area. Of course, the Karnef priests followed, shades and all. Upon entering the sacred ground, the shades suddenly became fearful, skittish, unsure of themselves, as the link to his power was severed. One of the druids stepped forward and took Kotel's hands and stared into his eyes, unblinking.
"Something is within these ones,"
he announced, and those acting oddly were grouped together, while the rest of Karnef's priests watched on.
"Yes, something unnatural resides within, and they are not complete. Bring them to the circle."
They were led to the standing stones, and herded easily into the centre. Their wills weakened, and their minds clearly confused. Chanting was heard, and shortly after the divination was concluded.
"I do not know what has transpired within your temples, but these," he said, pointing to the shades, "are not your people. Well, not truly your people."
The rest of the Karnef representatives looked on, and clearly did not understand what the druid was stating.
"To put it simply, your priests are dead. These are impostors."
At this point, the shades seemed to gain control of their bodies again, and began shouting at the druid, demanding proof, and denying his divination results. At this point, the druids began to encircle them, and drew forth weapons of wood and bone. The priest's eyes glazed over, and the demonic part came to the forefront, and took over their actions. They leapt forward with speed, attacking the druids with claws they had not had before, as the demonic side showed through, warping the flesh of their hosts into vicious edges, and hardening their skin to protect their forms. The druids fought back quickly, sending lightning at them, shocking them, searing flesh from them, splitting the unnatural essence with each strike, and capturing it inside fetishes of dedicated bone as they struck home upon them. The confrontation was swift and final, and although they were slain, so were several druids. The Karnef priests were told quite simply that, "You may not take these bodies, as they are not of this world," and asked to leave and spread this word to their priesthood. They left hurriedly, with thanks and concern, as well as loss and anger. It would be the start of the distrust of the druidic ways by those who followed Karnef, as they did not fully understand what had transpired. The druids who were slain were committed to the earth, and offerings and ceremonies were performed, and their head druid, who had led the assault and the divination, led them and told them how to see the falsities. And so it came to pass that the knowledge that only those who followed the wild could sense and see the shades became known to the druids, and in time Riona would also be shown and told this. For the druids had warriors of their own, and were distrustful of most of the gods of the realms, and chose not to share this information. One thing was sure, and that was that no druid could ever be taken and made such a shade of, and then allowed to gain entrance to their sacred places. They were, effectively, not able to be taken by such subterfuge as the other priestheads would in time. He sensed that he had lost connection to those who had been slain at the point they entered some place of power in the wilderness. In time, he learned about the druids, and about their ways, and that they could sense his presence. They would be problematic in time, and all he could do was deal with them when the time came. He created those he had lost anew, and sent them far from where they had last been, to spread the word of Karnef elsewhere, to bolster other temples around the lands. At least their forms were still useful to him. The host known as the Wild of this prime now knew of an entity that was not of the prime, stealing the souls and life of others, and making their own twisted demonic forms of such. It reasoned that it was a demonic incursion, and took steps to warn other hosts of this. However, a host that is in place upon a world is not party to information another host gifts them to from on high, so he needed to force a way for the other hosts whose presence was focused upon this world to become aware of the problem before it became too much for them to combat. And so it closed itself off to the world for a time, while it tried to find an answer. The druids' influence upon the realm dwindled for a time, and the numbers stagnated. Eventually the answer was divined, and came in a form that his daemon would eventually use to get its own wishes heard. An ascension was needed. A rise to the host would allow all to hear the pleas and react accordingly within their paths. Yes, this would work, it had to work, or else the prime would fall to the ravages of a daemon kind of nature hitherto unknown. And so both sides began their plans to force an ascension, but neither side knew the intent of the other, and so continually worked against them where they were discovered. Perhaps had the Wild been privy to the fact of the demon's origins, or more precisely, the fact that it was in fact a host itself, things would have gone much faster, and with far less bloodshed, at least for their own kind. And so, as the time drew upon all, a great surge was felt around the primes, as a new god seemed to arrive, going by many differing names. But that would not matter, for Ashan was the first it chose to take under its new identity as a god, so he would continue as though all knew it as such, for the sake of ease of understanding. From the time of Ashan being established with Kotel and others firmly under the power's control, it took almost a millennia to craft and realize his machinations, and to finally have enough power and hidden forces to push forth and force an ascension. As he engineered the downfall of many high priests and the subsequent collapse of their faiths in regions across the prime, he waited and coerced others into aiding in their demise. This was working, and working well indeed. He became aware, however, of demonic planes working their way toward the Prime, eager to feast with such tender targets, although some, he suspected, were there to bear witness and understand this great plan further. Some of these unfortunate denizens soon became one with him, and he learned through several of their minions and the eventual absorption of one of their overlords that there was some form of leadership amongst the grouping, and that some had banded together in an uneasy truce, but to what end he could not discover. It did not, however, stop him trying, by destroying all that would not answer his thirst for knowledge. The demonic group had become allies through necessities, as their own planes had been destroyed, but they had been able to escape from the grip of this entity that consumed all. They observed through allies their demise and the twisted shades he created, and understood they could not fight this war and win, and to this end had only one hope for survival: to enter a Prime together and try and salvage their power and identities alongside the mortals of that realm. Their dethroned demonic husks would become brittle and fall to the void as they blended their threads with that of the Prime, and they would become something new, something unique among their kind, at least as far as they knew. They would no longer be overlords of their own planes, crafted from their own essences and sheer power, but instead become daemons of the Prime. They managed to break through the planes that surrounded one realm, one single Prime, and discovered that their nature was unknown to this place. This place had a shard of the wild here, and they could sense it, but although it was extremely powerful, it seemed to be encircled and held within an area they would come to know as Lassashar. They travelled for many months on the winds and currents of magic, and eventually settled on a place for their new beginnings. It was a seemingly empty place. Nothing more than plants and small animals could be seen at first glance. But as it turned out, it was full of creatures far more deadly than he had witnessed on other Primes. This place they named as Dominia, and it would be their new place of power, their own unified domain upon the Prime. And so they enacted rites and rituals and bound their essences to this place, this land, and in doing so severed their tethers to the planar energies they had survived on for untold aeons. They attuned to the realm's own magical energies and began to leech what they needed from it, discovering that magic upon the Primes was not as it was upon the planes. Here it was structured and followed rules set out by the ebb and flow between the elemental planes as well as the void itself, it seemed. They discovered that links could be made to the elemental planes easily, for them at least, and that they could pull magic from these places too, allowing for a vast magical store to be built up within their forms. But as they soon discovered, it was not as simple as it had been upon their own planes. On their planes, their realms, all of it was them. No matter if it were rock, a hill, a minion, or their own lashing energies, it was all essentially one essence, one mind of one purpose. Here, it was not the same. They had to create a form that was solid and reflected this realm. They needed to craft bodies that would endure aging as well as the ravages of the environment, but also they needed to find materials to create such, as they could not create a lasting material themselves, for the magic slowly seeped away or overloaded the object, causing it to become one with the magic flowing around the realm. They reached out into the world and travelled to discover possible answers to their plight, and found life that pulled minute threads from the closest demonic planes. In comparison, it was like a tap from a well was to a raging ocean's waves crashing upon a shore. But still, they were indeed using such magic. They discovered what would be known as demonologists, and they marvelled at the ability to craft, manipulate and imbue themselves with demonic energies, and began studying them. In time, their presence was sensed by the greater of their number, and they were approached with the offer of a pact. Now they knew all about pacts, and how they were often used to gain the soul of the unwitting, in exchange for an infinitesimally small portion of power to sate their mortal hunger. But they had demands of their own first. It was not long before information was gleaned, and small pacts were entered into, and they learned of the materials of the realm, and what was used by who, and for what purpose. They discovered that some materials were deemed to be gifts from the host themselves, and they were sought after by corresponding followers of such gods.
Perhaps these materials would suit their purpose. They sought samples of as many as they could, but discovered that very little existed upon this place, outside of where the wild lay, and so they began using their knowledge to instead begin infusing their own realm, Dominia, with their own magic, and then crafting new bodies from these materials. The first created was only a partial success, as they missed essential rituals and rushed the process as their power slowly waned. However, the second attempt was perfect, and so the first of their number was placed within it, but still it was found to be losing power. This option would prolong their existence upon this prime, but it was not a permanent solution. It was then they were introduced to one known as Zorma. This hulking creature, they called an ogre, was adept at the manipulation of demonic energies, and surprised them with his prowess and mastery, such as it was, with the smallest of their threads. He said he knew of a way, but it would mean giving up their very nature to the Prime in order to accomplish this, and they agreed. Zorma told them of the process and what was needed, and they obtained everything. The hardest part was gaining a sliver of a host, what Zorma called a spark of the true lights. However, as it turned out, these lights, although uncommon if not rare upon many primes, were plentiful upon this one, and so they captured a priest with a spark of pure divinity, or rather told them of their plight, and they agreed to aid them for insight into their old planes. And so the first recorded essence crystal was to be crafted, and it was a huge undertaking. Beacons were erected along the edges of their domain, and intricate rituals were performed to bind them to the very land they stood upon, and so they began to slowly hum with power as they pulled the flow of magic, gently nudging it towards them, and then taking this power and focusing it into a tight beam, a created tether of magic, which linked the central ritual that was to be formed. As the ritual was performed, Zorma called down aid from the elemental planes themselves, and huge elementals also joined in with, lending their own power and skills, and forging their essences to fuse and create the basis of what was to be crafted. Then, each of the daemons gave a part of their own essences to this ritual, and they were fused and bound into this new creation, forming their new realm's center, a gigantic purple-hued crystal with many facets, each displaying one of the essences used to craft it, of elemental kind as well as demonic, and they looked around in what they could only reason was joy, a non-survival-led feeling, something they had never had and never realized was possible. It felt good, but as they surveyed the realm they stood within, they discovered there had been an almighty price to pay, and their joy left them suddenly. The sheer power needed to create it led to life being drained from all those within Dominia. Only the most resilient remained. This had led to the lands now being totally devoid of lesser life. Trees had become stone, abundant small animals had become one with the magical flow, and had been drawn into the rituals and fueled the creation process. Zorma merely stated that, in order for life to flourish, life must pass. He stayed a while, and told them the ritual and how it needed to be done should it ever be needed again. He said he had to head to Lassashar, as there was something amiss with the great lights, and that he might not return. He never did. Now they had a seat for their power, and were truly eternal within their realm, just as they had been when they had a plane of their own. They vowed to work together to accomplish what they could to gain more power, and it was shared equally among them, gains given and losses felt. It was a strange sensation, but they adjusted and became accustomed to the new facts of existence. And then their reality was hit with a simple fact. He was coming. In their haste to become eternal once more and gain power and save themselves, they had not given a thought to the oncoming devastation that was him. They must prepare to repel him if it was possible, and they had observed the prime where the wild had severed connections to him and defeated his shades, and they knew they must approach the wild here and broker a pact of some kind, not just for their own existence, but for that of the rest of the prime, else they would have no prime to exist upon. They attempted to gain entry to this jungle known as Lassashar,
but discovered that their very essence would not allow them entry. In fact, the jungle itself seemed to actively repel them, and although they tried to follow envoys from priesthoods and traders into this place, they were always held at bay by the jungle's own strange magic. They could see this magic, but it was steeped in demonic magic they could not decipher, and reeked of an ancient power they did not know, as well as the heady overtones of divinity that rolled all around them. There was no way for them to enter to tell of this danger, and so they turned once more to the demonologists who had given them the information and the truths they had needed when they first arrived, and told them of their newfound existence, of their essence crystal, and offered to give them power in exchange for more favours. They, of course, agreed.
Their leader, Hurion, became a strong figurehead for their words and their teachings. He could have been said to be their priest had they actually been gods themselves, but they were not. Hurion told them that the energies of the demonic taste could not enter Lassashar, but could be carried within vessels imbued with divinity, effectively shielding them from the protections of the borderlands, as well as allowing them to be carried within some sacred areas unhindered. They thanked Hurion, and each gave him a mark, a daemonic gift of their own, and he became their first unified chosen, bearer of their word. Each of his lesser were divided and given a mark by a single of the essences, thereby tying them to that particular daemon. And so, the first daemonic believers were created. In time, this very act would see them to further power, and set them apart from their own kind by vast measure. For the simple act of choosing to be of the prime, and choosing to give those who willingly aided them and followed their guidance and teachings, and offering payments for service, as well as rewarding fealty, put them in good stead with the true lights. One of their number was selected to travel with Hurion, and so a shard of their essence was taken from their whole and placed within a vessel. It was imbued by a priesthood they eventually learned to be tied with the host of Rhiannon, and they were taken beyond the Vale of Lassashar. This place was a vast jungle, with strange obelisks that seemed to operate in a similar manner to their own beacons in Dominia. However, these seemed to draw power into this place and hold it there, preventing it from leaking away, and the air here was thick with magic, so thick it took great composure not to feed upon it. Eventually Hurion encountered one of the great lizards that ruled over part of Lassashar, and asked for an audience with their great sage, as he had word from beyond the veil for all of the great lights. The audience was granted, and in short time Hurion and the split essence were brought in front of the great sage, an old decrepit lizard. Hurion explained the circumstance and the need for this audience, and the sage nodded, requesting that the essence address them. The others in the assemblage stood back as the vessel was opened, and the once demonic entity spilled forth, crafting a body to communicate. The talk was long, and sagas were given by the sage in response to the facts the essence delivered. He spoke of the eternal wars upon the plains, and the fact that there was now an uneasy rest among them, as one of their kind was knocking on the doors of the primes, as he had once knocked upon the heights of the hosts themselves. The sage acknowledged this threat, and called forth representatives of the lights that were present, 16 in all. Each of them listened, and over the period of many days, all knowledge that the essence could gift on this matter it did, and the mood lowered from one of curiosity to one of quiet dread. The sage informed the essence that he did indeed know of this daemon, and that he had heard word from another prime, through the ties of the hosts, about the loss of some of their kin to this deformed creation. He also announced that this was the reason some of the true lights here had been dimmed forever, and the knowledge now passed to the rest of those present in a solemn atmosphere. But the sage continued. He told the essence, and all present, that there were other daemons combating this threat, but they were nothing to the sheer might of this creation, and that no demon, daemon, or kin purely of the plains could defeat it, for it had such mastery over them to be able to undo their very existence with a mere thought. The essence told its own story of how it had come to be here, and why it had fled all it had known, leaving it to collapse into nothing rather than have this creature take it for himself. It was then that the sage asked the simple question.
"And if you are standing here this day, and traversing this realm to warn us, and hold pacts and rights for those you now call allies, where is your home now?"
The sage and all present looked intently on as Hurian moved to stand with him. "My home is no more, my place of origin long gone to the void itself." And he looked to Hurian and nodded. "But I have found a new home here upon the Prime, upon this Prime, as have the brethren who fled with me."
"But you are a true daemon, and your essence betrays your identity. You are not from this place,"
a voice from the assemblage called out strongly. It came from a tall robed figure, adorned in symbols and standing firm in his metallic armor. "Yes, I know that, but I chose to leave that behind and become one with this Prime," he said, leveling his gaze at this creature, "and I will protect those who stand with me." Hurian placed his hand upon his lord's shoulder and smiled as he spoke.
"This one and his brothers came to me and mine in peace. They came knowing what they were and expected fear, hostility, and destruction. Instead, they found understanding and, in time, fealty. I am their first, their chosen. And if it is needed, I will fight for the right for my lord to be heard, Temeran."
The armored man took a step forward, towering over Hurian, even from a distance, and looked him over.
"There is no need for that, and I do not lift my sword to attack the just, Hurian. The mere fact that you are not tainted, controlled, or taken by this entity means that I will listen. If they are all like this one, then they are of no threat to our kind upon this Prime."
The sage nodded, and the meeting had been had. Additional meetings were called for, and many weeks the essence stayed within the borders of Lassashar, and during this time the sage announced that something was transpiring, and called the essence to an audience with Temeran. Hurian came along, as was his lord's wishes. It was here that the sage and Temeran told the essence that something was strange with his form, and that something had changed since the time of his dedication to the Prime, and his removal from the Deep Plains magics. It appeared that, although they were still demonic in nature, they were attuning slowly to the Prime, and although they would always be of demonic origins, in time they would become one with the Prime itself, and be as though they had always been present. In short, the wild would accept them as native to this place, and no longer turn against their existence. This was amazing news, and the essence could not wait to return to the others and let them know all that he had learned. But Temeran stopped him, and asked him many questions. He asked as much as he could till the essence began to feel magic waning, and the sage offered him a gathered essence to fuel his needs. It accepted it hungrily, and as he feasted, Temeran watched intently, his vision seeing the threads of the essence entwining as it fed, and realized he was seeing but a portion of the whole. The essence explained to him that they held their main power within the essence crystal they had needed to survive, and until they could walk among those of the Prime without the need for it, they would always be splintered. Temeran understood, and he noted this in case it would be useful at a later time, perhaps for others of their kind fleeing the scourge of the plains. A day later, the essence left Lassashar, carried by Hurian once more, and returned to Dominia, where he passed on all that he had learned. But they saw that he was somehow different, and in short time realized that sitting within this vessel was in fact slowing their acclimatization to the Prime. Problem was, they would not leave it in their entirety, but instead choose to leave a splinter of their essence within and walk their realm to speed up their attuning. As this attuning was taking place, they also held many meetings with dignitaries and people of station from the surrounding realms. They wanted to know more, to learn about their neighbours, and they, in turn, learned of the threat that was coming from the plains. They pledged to help each other. As their attuning neared completion, word arrived to them from an envoy that the grand ascension was upon them. They offered advice and guidance on what to do and where to go, and they talked among themselves and came to an overwhelming decision. They would attempt the path in order to combat the threat they all faced. From afar, Temeran watched their actions and nodded to himself. They were doing the right thing. They were trying to become what only a small number of their kind had ever achieved. He would continue to watch them and guard their shards if needed. He would do all that he could to ensure they were able to fight this threat, or else he would try to take the fight to the creature itself. The Grand Ascension required a chosen of each of their number to be sent forth, or their own essence in mortal form, vulnerable and stripped of immortality. This entity would move through the realms and enter the Temple of Ascension, which in this prime lay within a hidden place within the boundaries of Lassashar. While there, they would need to open a communion with the hosts above, and place themselves forth to become candidates for elevation to the hosts. They each travelled to the place of ascension, and entered as they were bid. Only 2 others were present, and they worked with them to traverse the terrain and gain entrance to this place of testing, within the borders of the land known as Lassashar. Eventually, after many days of arduous travel and testing of their ability and conviction, they gained access to the Temple of Ascension, and once inside, rested briefly, gathering their composure. One of the others who travelled with them offered to go first, and he stepped into the large inscription-covered circle that lay within the main chamber there. As he did, the symbols began to glow faintly, and the power within this place elevated rapidly, until they all felt the pressure of the divine pushing down upon their essences and souls. This had to be the place, and they were not wrong. A shaft of light came down from the glowing opening in the chamber, and many figures could be seen within it. The one who had stepped into the light first closed his eyes, and another beam shone from the larger beam, passing through him entirely. The chamber was filled with many motes of light that moved from within them, and circled the area, stopping at each of the forms in the light before returning to their origin. The light grew dim, but shone like the moon, and a voice was heard by all in a language they did not know, but strangely understood. "Welcome, child. You will be of the new host." And with that, he vanished in the blink of an eye, and the next stepped forth. The same happened again, beams, motes, and acceptance, and finally, the vanishing. Then they turned to each other and nodded, and they all stepped into the circle as one and waited. The light arrived, but it shone dimmer, and a form took shape between them, and they adjusted to circle it. "You are strange ones, not of this prime. How did you come to be here?" One of their number, the one who had travelled to Lassashar before, spoke for them, and explained briefly what had transpired, how they chose to leave their origins and drive forward to combat this threat to all primes, even at a cost to their own nature. The form seemed taken aback, and was assuredly surprised. "Well, it would seem that you somehow have learned the act of selflessness, and I knew none of your kind capable of such. Interesting indeed." The glowing form paced around them, checking them out intently, nodding and peering into their eyes, until it had seen each of them fully. "I think not. At least not as singular entities." They looked to each other and nodded as one, accepting the opportunity, and the form nodded in response. "You will be known as the Mother of All, and your title is to be held only by your kind who choose to turn their backs on their origins. No non-demonic essence may be granted this status, and you shall work as one mind with one goal, despite your separate essences." And the form looked to them each once more, ensuring all were of understanding. "This means that you are one, split into many smaller, as your origins would have granted you originally when crafted from the source. Count yourselves as lights, as you once were overlords,
and count your followers as priests, clerics, or whatever term you choose, as once you created minions that did your bidding from your own power. You will be the first true demonic lights among us, the first demonic host. And with that, they vanished from the Prime, losing their identities in an instant, until they reimagined their forms as their new hosts, and then returned to the Prime they left in the form of a pantheon of demonic gods, although none would know this, for to all non-hosts they were merely other hosts. Each of these hosts was splintered into two parts. The vast majority of them became their respective host, and the controlling portion of their identities was placed within one who would be an amalgamation, a blending of them all. Within the Hall of Lights, a new husk was created to hold their slivers as a combined whole should they be needed, should they wish to become as one. The mother of all was to be the identity of what would be to some as the mother of the demonic pantheon, the one who would sit above them, ensuring they obeyed the will of all. As long as it existed, they would be held in check, in addition to that of the checks and balances of the other lights, and would be guided by their combined wills. They would build their new host identities within Dominia, and gathered many to their sides, following their many facets, each with new host form being energized by the nature of their original powers as a demonic essence. The temples were set around the beacons that had devastated their land originally, each one linked to the beacon and using it as a tether to their new origins, their essence crystal. A central citadel was built and became the capital of Dominia, and within it lay their essence crystal, guarded and protected from sight and touch by many protections, wards, sigils, traps, as once had been recommended by Zorma before his great journey. Just in case, he had said, and naturally, Hurion gladly carried out such for his new lights. This new temple within their city became known as the Temple of Unification, for many reasons, partly due to their origins, and partly due to their goals, but others outside of this knowledge saw it as a beacon of light that all could draw to, and those following other hosts also gathered and set up representatives and petitioned for small temples to be erected, and to be part of this unification against the coming threat. It was a united stand, and this was more than they had ever hoped for. And so they began to build their forces, their own as well as their new allies, and prepared for the confrontation that would be held here all too soon, the first resistance against him. He had many pawns now, or rather mindless puppets, that reacted violently if discovered, but thankfully they rarely were, other than to those of the wild when they sought to root them out from their primes. This became something of an annoyance, but in time he was sure they would fall by the wayside. Whilst he built his own forces and toyed with the one prime he had chosen to represent himself as Arnash, his following had become strong, and was now pushing against the other religions, vying to control those undecided with regards to faith. The main benefit he had going for him was his conversion was absolute. There could be no doubt once they were his. How unfortunate for the others, he thought, allowing himself to feel contentment with his plans thus far. As he grew his power base further, it became apparent that some of those who were present that had ties to the magics from beyond the Plaything Prime were growing in power. They had seemingly allied themselves with a few of the other overlords in an attempt to gain favour, pacts, and other dark benefits, and he watched as they were controlled, twisted, or slain in their misguided grabs for power. Mortals, he sighed, laughing to himself inwardly. But then he saw something that caught his eye, and made him readdress his earlier thought. One of those humans, bristling with power from the deep planes themselves, seemed undetectable to his senses, except via direct observation. Clever little thing, he smiled. Hidden away and scurrying unseen through my domains.
He watched them intently from a nearby pocket of magic, as he wondered just what this one was doing. Apparently it was gleaning magic from other daemons, overlords in fact, in direct combat, and walking away unscathed, with portions of their very essence. "What are you up to, little man?" he wondered, taking a closer look. This human stepped across the barriers between the deep plains as though it were merely a pathway from one side of a road to another, effortlessly. "Even I cannot do this," he mused, and decided there and then that this one must be taken. Such abilities would serve him greatly. As he drew closer, the human seemed to notice his viewing efforts, and turned to face him across the void, and waved with a flourish of arms. He had seen this one before, and it was not human. Such deceit! This was the one that had drawn him deep into the plains before, for none had that many limbs nor such ability to mask its identity. Oh, this time he would turn the tables on this creature, for it was in his playground now.